2002 to 2005. He's been on the council many times. In fact, ever since my whole experience of PSNS over the last 6-7 years or so, Jeff seems to have been a fixture on the council, off and on, but very, very stalwart, loyal, hardworking. He's a retired pharmacist, worked at PRI for many years, and after he retired, he took up walking and began to get interested in natural history. Doesn't claim to be an expert on anything in particular, doesn't appear. He's just interested in everything that he sees as he goes out walking. He's a member of the Ornithology group, and tonight he's going to talk about something, bird supersenses. And I've got tons of really difficult questions lined up for afterwards, and I hope you have too. So now I'll hand you over to Jeff for his presentation.
Okay. Oh, good evening. Have you got the screen okay with the
yes,
with the talk?
Yes, we do. Oh, and it's gone black, but we had it a moment ago.
There we are.
Yes.
It up.
Yep.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Tom. I'm very pleased to be heading up a return of Curious Minds, even if it is a mini Curious Minds. In fact, as I'm presenting somebody else's paper rather than my original work, I think we're starting with small beginnings, and hopefully it will build to something bigger. This is my laboratory. Unfortunately, a lot of researchers have had their research work put back a bit because of lack of facilities, and are just unable to get on with their work. But there is evidence that everybody is getting out and about more, and we're all investigating our immediate countryside rather than having to go very far afield, even if we haven't even got facilities such as a bird hide. That's the laboratory, and into a bird supersense. I'm going to be talking in a singular of a singular supersense, not masses of them. It's rather a sensational headline in a way, but it comes from a brief article that I found in the press. And just before I introduce that, I'm going to launch straight into a quotation. And this comes from a naturalist and writer. And he wrote in British Birds in 1921, "It is very important that everyone who studies birds should have some acquaintance with their insides as well as their outsides." Well, I'm not sure that applies to very many of us, but this is briefly going to have a look at some of their insides. So this was the article that stimulated my interest in the first place. A bird's supersense may date back to the dinosaur era. And it went on, an organ that allows some birds to detect the movement of hidden prey by plunging their beaks into the ground seems to have been present 70 million years ago. And it's a very brief paragraph, and it went on, giving a little bit of detail about what's in the paper that gave rise to this summary. And it introduced a lot of questions in my mind about what this supersense was, how it worked, which birds might have one, and what sort of sense would be detectable after 70 million years. And it, on a bit of a digression really, it's very remarkable how you can read something several times, and on about the 6th time you read it, you notice something that didn't quite strike you the first time. And that's why I put the word movement in brackets, because the significance of the sense that is described in the paper is more to do with detecting hidden prey that is immobile. It's not moving itself. It's not sending out any signals that it's there. It's stationary. And that was part of the gist of the paper. Let's carry on. So these are the questions I did pose to myself. What is preserved and identifiable after 70 million years? What is that organ in the present living birds? And which birds do we know that do have one? And how does it work? So this is the sort of bird we're talking about. A curlew, something that we're all familiar with. We hear them often before we see them, but we hear them and see them all the time. And this is that beak. It's a very slender, fine bit of bone, honed by evolutionary forces over the years to be very fine and very good for probing deep into the mud. So what sort of organ can be contained just within that very fine bill? And as if to accentuate its fragility, oh, sorry, I've gone on. Let's go back again if I can. I think my pointer works, doesn't it? You'll notice the bill is actually fractured. It is a wee bit fragile, but it had been lying around on a moor before I found it. And I don't know, maybe that fracture was a contributory factor in the bird's death. Who knows? So this was a paper that I was referred to. The Cretaceous origins of the vibrotactile bill organ tip in birds. Now, the Cretaceous is the period, the historical period that was leading up to the grand extinction event, the last big extinction event in 66 million years ago. Vibrotactile really means just that, detecting mechanical vibrations and locating a prey by that means. It was an open access paper, so I could read it. It was very convenient. I could read it all rather than having to rely on an abstract. And the authors of the paper had studied the bills of 353 species of birds. That's quite an amazing total, I think, because they wanted to get a representation from from 210 families from all orders of birds. And they did that study by searching the literature first to see what had gone before them. And when I looked at one or two references in the paper, it did refer back to the 1990s and the 2000s. And in fact, indeed, I had been aware that the bills of some birds were to some degree sensitive, though I didn't appreciate any of the ways in which it might work. But there was a limited amount of research already done, so they had to look at fresh specimens as well. And they did make the point that no fresh specimens were killed, especially for the research. They relied on collecting specimens when they became available, such as road traffic accidents, or people just finding them or whatever. And in addition, they looked at 4 species of lithornithids. That's just a group of birds that were living at the end of the Cretaceous period, and they may or may not have survived through the extinction event. In looking at 353 species of birds, the authors were very careful to distinguish between sensory organs in the bill tip belonging to birds that did not tend to probe into the mud to find their prey. They looked at they looked for 4 sensory organs in a bill tip in those birds that use probing into mud and sand, but relying on directly touching that prey in order to find it. And what we're more interested in, specifically in this paper, is the presence of organs in a bill tip where the prey was not touched, it was remote, it was some distance away from the bill, and yet it was detected. And the authors were able to identify a distinct pitting pattern in the bone associated with cells that were sensitive called Herb's corpuscles. And I'll return to Herb's corpuscles in a short while. Interestingly, they found the presence of these remote touch organs in just 3 groups of birds, 3 groups of birds that are totally unrelated to each other. The ibis and storks, the ostriches, emus, and the kiwis, and some shorebirds. Now, shorebirds isn't a very clear definition, but I'll be a bit more precise later on. So this is the sort of thing we're talking about. Back to our tip of the curlew, and there's a distinct pattern of pits visible in the tip of that bill. And that's what, 5 millimeters in length at the very tip of the bill. And those are obviously on both sides and also on the upper surface of the upper mandible there. Unfortunately, it's not a very good photograph either, but the fact is that as I found this bone on a moor, it had suffered a bit from weathering or just being knocked about or blown about. So it's not very clear. So the pattern isn't so clear on the lower mandible, but it is there. There's bony pits that extend round the tip of the lower mandible as well. Now, so the paper decided postulated that if the organ is associated with those dense pits in the bone at the tip of the beak, then it's that pattern that has the potential to be preserved, called an osteological correlate, but yes, but we all know what that means. So, provided the sensory pits can be reliably differentiated from those other sensory organs that I referred to, and then if the ornithid species that they also looked at show those same features, then their hypothesis is that it justifies proposing that those linornithid birds had the same sensory abilities and therefore foraged in a similar manner. For some reason, I've stopped moving on. Oh, here we go. So this is the point they're making. These are the, let's ignore ducks and geese for the time being. These are our 3 groups of birds, totally unrelated, on which I put on to my own design of an evolutionary tree. So I've only put dotted lines in there because a wee bit of uncertainty about some of the features, such as just when these different groups of birds diverged from each other. But one interesting point about this graph is that this line leading from the highest division of birds down through the little ornithids and down to the ratites is a singular line where the ratites represent the sole surviving members of that group. All the other birds are derived on this other line. So these are totally, if you like, most remotely related to any of the the birds on this side of the diagram.
What are ratites, Jeff?
Sorry, yes, I forgot, I hadn't explained ratites. That's the emus, ostrich, rheas, those large flightless birds of various continents. And closely related is the tinamou. That's all. It's just that very small select group of birds, sole representative of this whole line of descent from whatever, 80 million years ago. And then the other three groups, the two groups, the ibis and storks, not very closely related to our group of shorebirds here. And the shorebirds I've narrowed down to these family names, which won't be familiar to any of us. But it's the only way of describing the group. It's a very specific group. Now, a little bit about those Herbst corpuscles. The cells responsible for the sensitivity of in the organ, they're sensitive to vibration, and they can measure acceleration in a medium due to changes in pressure. And I had to find another paper to try and find out what this actually might have meant. And I came across a paper from 1990, no, I've forgotten when that was, 1998. So this paper made the point that most mollusk prey are not highly mobile. In fact, they can be completely stationary. So they are unlikely to emit vibrational signals themselves. Also struck me that if we're talking about soft prey like ragworms and lugworms, they might be a bit more difficult to detect by this means anyway, because they might be in soft. They're not going to, the signals aren't going to be reflected off their body as well as they would off the solid shell of a mollusk. So it's not the mobile prey that is significant here, it's the fact that they are immobile. The sensory mechanism involves the perception of pressure gradients formed when the bills probe in soft sediments in which inanimate objects block pore water flow. The key to that is in the next paragraph as well. Pressure gradients in dry sand do not travel far and are short-lived. So we're talking here about probing into wet, soft sediments, muds and sands. And there's the pressure gradient is initiated from the bird's bill itself, and it picks up reflections from inanimate objects. This paper used red knots as an example. Repeated probing by red knots in soft, wet sediments induces a residual pressure build-up of sufficient strength to detect pressure disturbance caused by a nearby object. The pressure waves deflected by that hard objects, the waves must go round it as well, and the resultant pressure variations can be detected. And then the effect is, I think, the last bit is that it's magnified by repeated movement of the bill in a probing manner to make it even more sensitive. So this was the accompanying picture on that paper, featuring the bill of a red knot. And it's a lovely couple of photographs. The second one here, in particular, was taken with the aid of an electron microscopy. So rather finer detail showing up than by the use of light. And you got this beautiful pattern of pits, bony pits in the bill, Again, 4 to 5 millimeters in length, if that, on the tip of the red knot. So this is the fellow we're talking about. Red knot, called red knot because in the breeding season it has a lovely red blush all over its breast and belly. This photograph was taken at the end of August, beginning of September. It had just flown down from its breeding grounds in the Arctic, and at some point it had molted that breeding plumage, and it's in this rather drabber but still attractive grey plumage, not obviously a red knot, or not looking like a red knot. So back to that paper, the original paper. So they studied the bills of 353 species of birds representing 210 families from all 41 orders. And there's a few accompanying pictures with the article, and there's I think there's because there's a detail of 353 species, there's a wealth of detail also published as backup to that paper, but I couldn't find access into that to be able to look at that. But never mind, we did. There were some accompanying diagrams. The paper looked at a kelp gull, but this is probably a herring gull that I found on the beach. So a typical bill. If you look at the tip, there's indentations. It's not absolutely smooth bone, but there isn't that regular pitting pattern. So the herring gull does not possess this remote probing ability. It's not the way it feeds anyway. It relies on eyesight, perhaps on a bit of smell and maybe a bit of hearing, but primarily eyesight. It hasn't got the sensory bills, pits. Likewise with the gannet. This was a gannet I've cleaned up. It was fresh when I found it. There's rather nice pitting pattern in this bill, but it's just a few pores on each mandible. Again, not the distinctive pitting pattern that we've already seen on the curlew and the knot. So again, the gannet, as you'll be familiar with its feeding methods, it's not probing into mud and sand. This is a feature from the paper for a tinamou. The tinamou isn't a ratite, but it's very closely related. Ratites are the flightless birds. The tinamou actually does fly, though I don't think it flies very well. But the point about this bird is that it's closely related to a kiwi, but itself, it doesn't depend on probing for food. That bill is not used for probing into mud. It feeds in a more conventional manner, picking things off the surface. But it does show this pitting pattern on the bill. So that's one representative of that first group of birds that does show that pitting pattern, which is, for some reason, has been retained in its tinamou, although it does not make use of any ability to probe for remote prey. Now, I'm afraid I'm not very good at interpreting histology pictures. One cell, I find, very much depends on the way it's stained and looks very much like another one. So maybe these are herbs corpuscles in pits, but I can't make any intelligent comment on them. Now, the kiwi is the closely related ratite. It is typical of the rest of the ratites in having these bony pits on the bill, similar to the tinamou. And even if you haven't seen a kiwi, because it's way down there in New Zealand, you'll probably be aware that it lives in woodland and it probes into soft leaf mold for prey. It does use that remote foraging ability. In damp soils, it will use this ability to pick up remote prey. I think it also has been shown that the kiwi does retain the sort of the mental capacity to interpret such a signal where the tinamou doesn't. The tinamou theoretically has those cells in bony pits on the bill, but the parts of the brain required to interpret any signals isn't there to the same extent as it is in the kiwi. And the second group of birds were the ibis and storks. So this is the ibis, and again showing that bony pitting pattern on both mandibles. So those are the 4 examples that we've looked at. And if you look at the patterns on each one, they're all remarkably similar in these 3 unrelated groups. And you can compare them with the Lithornithid pattern. Again, I think no, that's the same one, that's a different one, and it's just discernible that there is a pattern of pits there, but it's so heavily worn that one can't be 100% side positive, I don't think, but the distinct pattern on this both upper and lower mandible of this specimen. So the hypothesis that the paper's authors were putting forward that because these pits are so restricted in distribution amongst birds and they're so similar to the appearance of the pits in the Lithornithid, that it's justifiable to deduce that the Lithornithids have the same abilities as the curlew, the kiwi, and the ibis. And because of this peculiar distribution, it was thought that, and this close similarity across this range, that it was justifiable to consider that maybe the sensory ability evolved maybe just the once and survived in these 3 lines, and therefore it must have evolved perhaps 80 million years ago, way back before this major split in the 2 lines of all our birds. Now I put in ducks and geese there because that's another fairly singular line. The ducks and the geese broke away from all the remainder of the birds, with the exception of 1 or 2 more families down here as well with them. And followed, yeah, so they broke away so very early on. I did mention that the paper's authors did identify sensory abilities in different types in different bills, and they're all Herbst corpuscles. Herbst corpuscles, in fact, are not restricted to sensory organs in a bill, and they are found in various other tissues in various other birds. I don't know quite how widespread they are, but they are, for instance, found in the wings of pigeons. They are found in the bristles of some New Zealand birds, They are found in the oropharynx of, I've forgotten what species it was, but they're fairly widespread. And in the case of ducks, let us just do a little bit of dissection on the mallard. They are spread right across the bill of the mallard, but the bill can be split into 3 parts. And in the tip of the bill, there's Herb's corpuscles along with another type of sensory cell. In the middle section, there's Herb's corpuscles along with, I think, 2 other types of sensory cells. And in the top end, there's Herb's corpuscles with another type of sensory cells. So these are going to be sensitive to maybe movement close by, to touch, taste, whatever. But now I want to just spend a little time actually looking at the more interesting birds, the ones that we like to be seeing around about here and perhaps a bit further afield as well. So the 2 families that I've identified as those groups of shorebirds that carried this remote sensor ability are the Scolopipatidae and the Thalauropidae. The Scolopidaceae includes then the snipes, sandpipers, curlews, turnstones, godwits, redshanks, and of course the woodcock, because Scolopax is Greek for woodcock, and it's reflected there in the scientific name for the woodcock. And that's where the family name comes from. There's only 3 species in the Thalauropidae, and we could see just the redneck phalarope. It's the Arctic breeding birds. The redneck phalarope breeds as far south as some of the northern islands of the Shetlands. So this family, or those 2 families, do not include oystercatchers and plovers. So this is a problem. This is us on the Tay estuary. It's low tide, but the tide's going to come in again. It's going to get dark. And when I took this photograph, it was windy. So the water, there's water here. It's not that might look a bit more like sandbank, but a lot of this is water, and it's all ruffled by the wind. So the birds have to feed, and they've got a brief window there when conditions might be suitable for them to do so on our estuary. What we might find here are very large congregations of oystercatchers. I'm on the south side. Unfortunately, conditions for the birds are much better on the north side along here, perhaps past the reed beds here, but into Invergowrie Bay. There's a very good feeding area in there. So it could be a lot of oystercatchers, could be a lot of redshank any time of the year. It could be a lot of golden plover, and smaller numbers of other birds. Not a large number of species there. Only talking about our singular family now, but interesting because they are there. This is the oystercatcher then. So this one feeds just by eyesight, by probing underneath the seaweed there. It's got that stout, massive bill, capable of getting a limpet off the rocks. It can bash open a whelk, drill a hole, and if that fails, then it will hammer a whelk onto the rock to smash it. And it has a variety of feeding techniques. Golden plover might be seen in large numbers in winter down on the estuary, otherwise they'll be tending to breed on the moorland. These birds I found photographed in end of August, beginning of September. They were spending most of their time on the fields nearby, still tending to probe into the grassy banks rather than feed on the mud. Seen here, so they got down to this wee locken to wash rather than to feed. Plumage not as bright as it is in the breeding season. And if you wander around on the moorlands, this is one of those vocative, stirring sounds that you get, suddenly hear this single, it's always called mournful, this single piping from a bird that's probably standing on prominent perch somewhere on a boulder, somewhere very slightly above the surrounding moorland, just giving that single pipe to warn the nesting birds all around about that I'm there. Ring plover, another of the plovers then. Again, these birds haven't got the remote sensing ability. The ring plover, you're more likely to find, well, you find it both on the rocks and in the seaweed and running around on the beach. And on the beach, it will feed very regularly by running rapidly, standing, probing rapidly. Depends on eyesight, a quick movement into a new area. And the turnstone. Turnstone is a Scolopendid, Scolopendacea. Has got the sensory ability and isn't perhaps as well developed or made use of as the other species. Turnstone, as its name implies, feeds by turning stones over. So it probes underneath stones, flicks them over and goes for shrimps and sandhoppers. It'll probe into that weed there. Quite a stout bill. It can probably lift off one of these limpets and get a limpet as well. So that's the way the turnstone feeds. And the single member of the Phalaropidae that we might see, this one was taken on Fetler in Shetland. It swims rather more than most other waders. And while it's swimming, it has a habit of turning around in circles. So it sends up, disturbs the immediate water, which disturbs the sediment on the base of the bottom of the locken here, and brings up tasty morsels to the surface from where it would pluck them. So that's one method of feeding. But with that bill, it will also probe into the mud and quite likely depends on that remote sensing ability to find its prey. Interestingly, this is a case of reversal of sexes. This is the female. The male, this was the beginning of August. The male at this time would have incubated all the eggs, and it would be now looking after the chicks. The female, having laid the eggs, leaves into it. It takes no further interest in the process. Beginning of August, this bird is just about to fly off from Shetland down to the Pacific Ocean. Sanderlings, referred to as clockwork toys sometimes, they have this habit of running down a beach following a receding wave, pecking, probing rapidly in the very wet, damp mud quickly, and then running back again before the incoming wave catches them. It doesn't always depend on that method, and it will take a more leisurely approach and probe more slowly, spending time in the typical way of these waders. The sanderling is a sandpiper. I haven't got a picture of a common sandpiper. They flit along the beach there and then fly rapidly away. And they tend to be quite often insectivorous anyway. But the sandpipers will probe into that sand and locate the prey in the way that we've described. And our curlew again, here it's push that long bill most of the way into the mud, and it seems to be angling sideways to find something and to get it out. It's probably hasn't kept its bill stationary there, waggling away about a bit to get those sensory waves reflected off suitable prey. Similarly, the godwits have this very long beak and use it in that manner as well. With that long beak, the other advantage of being able to probe deep into mud is to probe into deeper water. So a black-tailed godwit particularly will paddle out into quite deep water for a bird and use that long beak to be able to reach down into the mud there. They're looking, of course, for ragworms, lugworms, as well as whelks, cockles, mussels. And these animals will be in the mud, but they do have to come to the surface of mud, either to feed, filtering suitable debris from the water, or to breathe. So it's at those times that they become visible, and that's what the birds depend on. That's why they're rushing into receding waves to try and spot the tiny signs of an animal being there underneath the surface of the mud. And the redshank, similarly, you're probably fairly familiar with the redshank. It's that bird that's so easy to identify because it has got red shanks, and it's fairly unusual in that respect. And the dunlin. Again, rather a short bill, this one. It's got the shortest bill. Variation in plumage there. They both, this is again the end of August. They've both flown south from breeding grounds. The one on the right there is molted, and this is a juvenile. Need to look closely at that one. But the one on the left here, still showing signs of breeding plumage, and it's about to molt. And snipe. That rather business-like bill, I rather like this one. It's stout looking. And that one will probe into the mud. Don't often see them like this, unfortunately. The snipe is the one that will give you a fright every time you come across it, as it flies out from underneath your feet and zigzags away rapidly before you've really seen it properly. And although you know it's there, you might have heard it, you know it's good marshy terrain, suitable for nesting snipe, it always makes you jump when it comes out from underneath your feet. unfortunately, I haven't got a picture of a woodcock, but a woodcock is a sort of stouter version, stouter beak, stouter body, with shorter legs, and eyes possibly larger than this one. The woodcock won't be found here. It's taken to living in woodland, and it will use that bill to probe into the leaf mold in the woodland. And those large eyes probably help it locate things by sight as well, because it's largely feeds at night rather than daytime. So it's sort of taken to occupying the niche that the kiwi does in New Zealand. So that's the conclusion of my investigation into those sensory organs, as in the paper, and a brief look at the birds that, most of those birds that have that sensory ability. So I should take a rest now, fortunately not having to tuck a long beak into my plumage while standing on one leg. Thank you.
Well, that was really good, Jeff. I never knew birds could be so interesting. I mean, really fascinating.
Thank you, Tom. Yes, of course they are. They're lovely to look at. They're lovely to watch the behaviour, and then they have surprises for you as well.
I'm all enthusiastic. We're going looking at birds now. Yeah,
that's the idea.
So, questions. I've got one to start with. Okay. How do they, I mean, clearly they're sticking their beak into the mud and then they generate some kind of a pressure signal. And that pressure signal is reflected back off of the object. And then the sensor organs sense it. So how do they generate that pressure signal? Is it just the beak plunging into the mud, or do they emit a noise, or do they?
I think it's just a very light vibration. Frequently watching a bird using its bill, it will sort of waggle with a small pitch that bill to get it more easily into the mud and the sand.
Right.
But if the bill is also just slightly vibrated at the time, then that will set off a series of waves, and it's waves that then transmitted by a fairly fluid medium that would be reflected off a reasonably solid prey.
Yeah, amazing. So any other questions? Yeah,
I've got lots. I was intrigued with the thought that these herbst corpuscles can appear in other parts of a bird's anatomy as well, including, I think you mentioned, associated with the wings of some birds, such as pigeons, I think. Does that ring a bell with you?
Yes, that's right. That's what I said, yes.
And the reason I'm intrigued by that is I know a little bit about aerodynamics, and I know how interesting it is if you're flying to know what airflow is doing over the leading edge of a wing. And you can do a lot if you can feel what the airflow is doing. And I'm wondering if some birds have abilities to feel and sense changes in airflow so as to be able to have much better control of their flight than simply by trial and error. And I wonder if anyone's done any work on that. And you pick up buffeting, for example. If you get a buffeting from the leading edge of a wing, it's a very good warning of an impending stall, which is a useful thing to know about. And so I'm wondering if some birds are exploiting that ability to maximize the control of flight at very low speeds and close to obstructions and that sort of thing.
Well, I think that's precisely it, yes. I think it's probably early days as far as these investigations go. If the pigeon has this sort of capability, then I imagine there's a lot of very good flyers that
Yes.
also probably have that as well.
Yes.
But certainly it's going to be that sort of mechanism that they're utilising to keep themselves fully informed of what's happening around the wing.
Yes. Yes. I don't suppose anyone's attempt to do a brain scan of a bird in flight to see what signals it's picking up. That's probably a bit beyond the technology. The other thing I thought I would throw in, because you probably know it already, but it's useful to know, of course, is that the great division between birds, the carinates and the ratites, the birds with deep keel-like breastbones, from the Latin carina, and the birds with flat raft-like breastbones, from the Latin ratis, being a raft. And the ratites are reckoned to be very, very early, and very few survive. That's why what you were saying, Jeff, was so interesting, showing that this feature is present in both the ratites and the carinates, meaning it has to go back to dinosaur times, because it has to go back to before those two branches split. Some dinosaurs have sort of flattish raft-like breastbones as well, and I don't think any of them have the keel-like breastbone of most modern birds. So that's quite an interesting fact. And when one thinks, what would a dinosaur that wasn't a bird have been doing with this particular organ and sense? And will we one day find a dinosaur with evidence of what sort of life it lived and what it did with this vibration sensing technique?
Yes, that's right. More and more bird fossils from that period are turning up, particularly in China and I think parts of Germany. And yes, we could get to grips with that. I think that's a whole new field that that is of interest to myself, but I'd hesitate to present it to anybody else because it seems a bit esoteric. But as regards to the ratites and the tinamous, yes, the tinamou does fly.
Yes. Where does it live?
It does have a breastbone, that keel. Closely related to the ratites, but it isn't a ratite because it does have that pronounced keel to support massive, strong breast muscles, wing muscles.
David Thistlethwaite, question.
Thank you. Thanks, Tom. Just following on from David's question, it seems to me that if you have a sensory cell that's located in some species in a mandible and in other species in the wing, that sensory cell must have evolved many millions of years before the time that Jeff's talking about. Because presumably, in evolutionary terms, it had a single origin. And then over eons of time, it moved in some birds to the wing and some to the beak. And so David's point about going back to further dinosaurs, I think is very relevant. To me, it's most interesting that it's found in two particular parts of the birds.
Yes, yes, indeed. Thank you, David.
If I could raise a point here, it raises an interesting thing about, can you hear me?
Yes.
It raises an interesting point about ducks and geese. They seem to have either lost this ability for this sense, or have never acquired it in the first place. Perhaps that strand of birds should have left the mainstream much further back. What do you think?
No. I can't draw up my diagram very easily again, but the ducks are rather more closely related to all the other birds.
Yes.
It's just one line that did diverge fairly early on in evolution, but the divergence from the ratite tinamou line was definitely very much earlier than that. The divergence of ducks possibly predated the age of the lithornithids that were quoted, or they could be the same sort of age. That's why my diagram was dotted lines, because I'm not quite sure the relative ages of those points. But yeah, the divergence of the ducks didn't happen any earlier than I'd indicated on that diagram.
Yes. But you were saying, Jeff, that the ducks do have these Herbst corpuscles in certain parts of their bills, but they don't do this vibration sensing thing. What do they do?
Thank you, David.
Yes, what are they're sensing? Yes, it's interesting question. They are there in conjunction with a number of other types of sensory cell, which possibly a taste and at least some touch. I don't know if it's a hangover or quite what.
Jeff, I have some questions about this Supersense and kind of how the bird uses it. So it sticks its beak in the mud, waggles it about a wee bit, and then senses the reflections coming back, yeah? So
Yes.
over what distance does that sense work? Is it really short range, or does it detect it over a bigger distance? Part two of the question is, can it tell the direction? If there's an object, a squiggly creature in the mud, can it actually sense where that is, the direction, the depth, and yeah?
Good point.
Yeah. So, and then before you start speaking, I'll ask the third part of the question, and that is, if there's a flock of these birds all sticking their beaks in and generating noise, okay, one, does they interfere with each other? Or two, can they actually detect signals emitted by other birds, deflected or absorbed? You know, in other words, do they operate cooperatively? That's my three questions. If you can answer them, you're a genius.
Right. Yes, I couldn't quantify distance over the distance that might be involved. The paper that I quoted to find out about how Herbst corpuscles might work got into very complicated fluid dynamics, so I didn't try to read it, but that might have been a way, that might have said something about it.
Yeah.
In the experiment with the red knots, they did they had buried objects in a bucket of sand, which the red knot was able to locate and not by direct touch. So that confirmed the idea of remote sensing. And that distance wasn't too great as far as I recall. I don't think that the vibrations would travel very far. It very much depends on the fluidity of the medium. So if you remember those sandalins probing into the sand mud that's only just being exposed by the receding wave, it's probably pretty fluid. And I imagine waves would travel quite well in that mud. Higher up the beach, where it's a bit drier, a bit more compact, the sensitivity won't go so far.
So you see this as really a kind of a local probe.
Yes, yes.
They got
You asked about cooperation.
Yeah.
Part of the feeding strategy has to take into account that a lot of the time these birds want to feed in flocks for security, so that for security from predation themselves. But they also want to find prey that's not necessarily going to be thick under the ground, and they want to maximize their own chances of finding something. So it's always a balance of finding your own patch, but being sufficiently close to everybody else as well.
Yeah.
And I don't think they're operating cooperatively. I don't think you'd pick up signals that somebody else is causing to be emitted. It's going to be a very local thing that the particular bird is going to detect.
Okay.
One aspect of that occurred to me was whether it might be possible to detect, distinguish between a stone and a whelk, rather than waste time going for stones, or even when you're pushing the bill into the mud, to avoid a stone so that there's no chance of injury. But that's another idea for investigation. I didn't pursue that one any further. That's just a thought. But if your prey is absolutely immobile, then you're not going to be able to determine whether it's a stone or a whelk. But if there's any movement at all in the prey, then and that would tend to eliminate the stone.
Fascinating. Any other questions? Comments?
Here's a little question. Have you had a look at the structure of these corpuscles to find out how they are actually detecting these pressure differences?
No, I didn't go any further into that. I thought I'd gone sufficiently deeply for my own interests, and I got some idea of what they were actually doing. As I said, with those histology pictures, there is the picture of the cell there, but it doesn't really take me much further.
Okay, thank you.
I've just posted a link in the chat for everybody. I found a paper on Science Daily talking about these corpuscles. It does sort of hint vaguely at how they might work on hydrodynamic principles, and the one question that Tom didn't ask in his 5-part 3 questions, the resolution of these things seems to be larger than a grain of sand.
Amazing.
Interesting.
That's
Interesting.
Yeah.
Good.
John, is that a...
This is a very unscientific, quite trivial question. I'm just wondering if you'd be surprised to know that the woodcock was photographed in a garden in Perth only a few days ago.
Yes, that'd be lovely. I haven't been able to photograph one myself. But yes, I was skiing in the woods here when there was good depth of snow, and I was wondering what was happening to the woodcock there and whether they might be dropping down to somewhere else where it might be snow free. So yes, not altogether surprising, perhaps.
Jeff, Gordon Freeman speaking. Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Changes in pressure are in fact sound waves. I just wonder if you put a highly sensitive detection system in, whether you could actually hear these vibrations. And when you look at the corpuscle, they look like some kind of tune resonant filter, as if it would detect over quite a narrow band of sort of wavelengths of sound waves or pressure waves.
Yes, that makes sense. It could work that way.
No, I just wondered if it was a step that anyone had actually tried to detect, by some kind of microphone or equivalent to, in terms of what was in terms of whether you could detect what the sound wave or the pressure wave was that was being emitted. I presume it's quite low frequency. I don't know. I'm guessing that.
Yes, probably. Yes, no, I haven't investigated it any further. Yeah, that's another possible line.
Howard Chapman has just asked a question on the chat line saying, fascinating, presumably the bird only needs to detect prey within its range of bill movement. I guess that's right. It's going to be a short-term thing because it stick its bill in, is there anything close to here? Yeah, it doesn't want to know about things that are a long way away because it's got to move. So any comment on some wader ability to adjust the position of the tip of its bill? Not sure what that means.
No, there is some flexibility in the bill. It does have an ability. They do have an ability to open the end of the bill in order to grab prey and even to swallow it, perhaps with the aid of the tongue, whilst keeping the base closed. So there is that flexibility, but beyond that, I don't think it would be applicable.
Any more questions?
I was going to throw in
David,
a
yes.
purely birdie thing, not to do with specific to do with a Supersense. Just to mention that I'm fairly sure I saw a rough-legged buzzard in Viewlands Park yesterday,
Mm,
perched low down in a tree. Is that possible?
rough-legged. Oh.
Definitely
one
rough-legged. It
found
was wearing
dead in-
trousers.
yeah. There was one found dead in Fife in about 1987 or 8, something
Right.
like that.
Well, this one was alive and well.
It was on, but that was a migratory.
Yes,
accident.
yes.
I've seen one, but that was during a migratory season,
It was.
and that was also in Fife.
Yes,
Maybe it's been blown off course.
yes.
Oh, yes.
Mhm. Well, this one was alive and well, perched in a tree, only about 20 meters away from me.
Mm.
Jeff, can I ask, how would they? Presumably spoonbills fall into this category as well, do they? And if so, how does the shape of their bill affect their ability to sense finely or less finely?
No, they don't. They're out with this family. They
Right.
utilize the spoon by sort of sweeping it to and fro just underneath the sort of the water,
Yeah.
surface of the water, and sort of filter out floating prey that way.
Right.
They'll probably try and pick stuff off the surface, scoop it up as well. But not really probing deep and
Right.
using the sense that I've been talking of.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah, great. I have a question, another one.
Yes.
One day when all this COVID nonsense is over and we run back to some kind of real life instead of virtual life, would you take me out to see some birds?
The short answer must be yes. It's, one hesitates because, as I said, I'm not an expert in anything. And you have to be prepared, perhaps not to see much, not to see anything. It'd be nice to think you could go out there like Ollie and say, well, this is the right sort of countryside to find a woodcock. Ah, look, there's a woodcock over there. It doesn't quite happen like that. But yes, we need to get out.
The bird group have outings, do they not? Why not invite them to along one of those?
Yes, indeed, yes.
A supplementary question, which would apply to birds generally. I mean, you have the beak being, or the bill or whatever, being a keratin sheath over a bony structure, which is a very common thing. I mean, cattle horns are the same thing, keratin sheath over bony structure and so on. Hoofs and human fingernails are the same thing. What is the mechanism by which a bird's beak grows, regenerates, wears, so as to keep its shape, but be replacing the bits that's wearing off at the end and perhaps splitting? I'm just looking at there must be that must vary a lot with birds because their beak shape varies so much. The process of regenerating that sheath, and I'm sure someone could do something clever with build up of minerals in the beak as it grows, the way that you can pick up cyanide and arsenic in human fingernails and so on. What is the mechanism by which bird beaks regenerate themselves in the right shape?
Well, if you're asking me, that's a difficult question. We've lost a lot of ability to regenerate very much at all.
Yes.
And you think about worms, certain worms that you might be able to split in two, and they're both ends will regrow the relevant bits.
Yes.
Crabs, I think, can't they lose limbs and regrow limbs?
Yes, yes.
So, yes, there is that ability to regenerate in a lot of instances.
But with keratin parts, even we grow them all the time. Our fingernails and our hair and so on is constantly regenerating.
Exactly.
That's the nice thing about keratin, is that it can be regenerated quickly in that way. It's meant to. I mean, that's how it works. So there must be a mechanism. But just because bird beaks such a funny shape, I'm just wondering how birds do it. I mean, it must be growing all the time, like fingernails. But how do they do it to keep it the right shape?
Is it like hair? Do the follicles affect the shape, whether it's straight or curved?
Just wondered.
Cells emanating the keratin.
Yes, yes, yes.
I don't know.
Perhaps there are chiropodists for bird beaks who trim them.
Yes, yes.
They're called limpets.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So I sort of have a question. I've kind of ended up being the master of ceremonies or whatever here. But who's in charge of this evening? And how long are we going on? And when do we finish? And, are we at that point, or are we still happy discussing things?
Well, if there's any more questions, then I'd be happy to try and field them, but otherwise.
John, I think, is hosting in the background, is he not? I think he is.
Ah.
But we now have our official PSNS subscription, so we're not under any time limit.
All right, very good. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I wanted to start. The recording is getting quite large.
Right.
So I'm going to stop recording because.
Okay, well, I'll tell you what, is someone doing a vote of thanks? Because